Hold on. Ooh,
Oh, yeah, no worries. Hey, Viv, how's it going? Good to
hi.
see
Good.
you. Good
See
morning.
you. Morning.
Excited to talk with you today. I have known
Mm,
Vivian Sayward for quite some time, and seen her progress and development with her own apparel line, Vivacity Sportswear, which you launched about 10 years ago. Is that right?
Is that crazy? It's been a crazy decade. Has it been that long?
No, it's a beautiful line. Can take you from the golf course to the tennis courts to the grocery store to the happy hour, all in one
To
outfit.
video. I mean, I'm wearing my
Yeah,
morning things all
video.
the time.
Yeah,
So,
super, 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 flexible wear in many ways in regards to where you can wear it. And Vivian, I know you have sold into resorts and you've also sold on cruise lines.
right.
And you are taking that 10 years of experience into helping other people develop their lines through Vivacity Advantage. So that's what we're here to talk about today.
Cool.
Are tips and tricks for folks that tips and tricks. That sounds kind of funny, right?
Yeah. How about avoiding some pitfalls? How's that?
Best
How's that?
practices in launching a line.
Yeah.
So I'll just be your kind of case study here. We'll role play a bit in that. Let's just say that I decide I want to manufacture a line of, I don't know, give me a scenario. Shirts, apparel, accessories. What do we want to
How about a shawl for travel? Let's start
Okay, a
there.
shawl for travel.
In this COVID pandemic era, what can we use to travel that's comfortable? How's that? Because
All right, perfect.
yeah,
All right.
okay.
Sounds
How's
good.
that?
So, what are the things that I need to be thinking about? Let's just say I have no experience in
Mhm.
the concept of both design and manufacturing. What are some of the things that you would talk to me about to help me think through the process?
I think what I do and what I've done with other folks is really sit down and kind of say, okay, let's do, before we even step into anything, before we spend any money on anything, let's look at the market. Let's look what's out there from a competitive standpoint. So I have an analytical mind as well as, so.
Yeah, you have a background in finance and
Right.
sales
So.
and marketing and all of the above. So you're perfect to blend all these things.
Definitely doing some of your, and this does not have to be, sophisticated in any means, but, talking to people, understanding what they're using. Let's say in this case, we're looking at this shawl for travel. What are your friends, as people are starting to travel again, what are they looking for? The comfort factor, cleanliness factor, protection, on a long plane ride, for example, or a car ride or whatever it may be. What kind of, what are they missing and what are they looking for? And really questioning that. I think amongst your friends or family members or whomever it may be. I mean, seriously, starting simple,
Yeah.
doing that, and then looking at what's out there in the market. Google is great. Google
Yeah.
searches, check Amazon, check other Nordstrom's, whatever websites you're looking at, and then really starting to understand, putting together a profile of who's your customer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what their needs are, and what kind of price points they may be. All those things are extremely important before you get into
Yeah.
making this whole product.
Absolutely. I mean, validating that you have a good idea
Right.
is extremely important. But to your point on price point, I have seen a lot of folks, both in apparel and accessories, frankly, fail. Ultimately, the business failed simply because they didn't get that price point right. And that obviously backs into where you're going to manufacture, how much you're going to spend on materials and
Right.
all of that, because you've got to have enough margin in your product, whether you're selling, direct to consumer and you can increase that margin, or if you're selling through wholesalers, you're going to have a lot of padding in that product to give both you a return and the middleman a return in order to make that product profitably.
Exactly. Those are excellent points, and really starting to get a feel for that as well. Who's buying, where are they, part of this whole customer profile is where do they buy?
Yeah.
Where do they find their products, their latest and greatest? And that depends on the demographic. It depends on, if it's an older, I'm generalizing here, an older demographic, they're going to be looking more on Facebook groups versus the younger ones who may be looking at TikTok or even Instagram or whatever it may be. Really understanding that from that standpoint.
So let's dive in, Vivian, to, kind of some pros and cons, about the manufacturing side. And I don't want to skip over the design side.
Sure.
I'm going to come back to that, but I want to get to the meat of the conversation I'm sure you're having with a lot of folks is, do I manufacture here in the US? Do I go to Mexico? Do I go completely offshore to Asia or India? Or maybe you can kind of talk about pros and cons and even illustrate some examples of companies you've worked with and your own line as well, of course.
Right. Well, with my line, I kept it local, because when I started 10 years ago, my customer base was they're price sensitive, but not as price sensitive. I was looking at more of the higher end lines, so they liked the approach of being made in USA. They liked, the aspect of it being designed locally, everything else. And it was definitely a very different look than what they were used to when I started. I started in golf and then kind of expanded from there. So that was really interesting and great from that standpoint. And it was word of mouth. Over the course of the 10 years, things have changed dramatically in fashion and apparel. The issues of how people used to find buyers, for example, used to buy product, were going to trade shows, there was actually, even 10 years ago, LA, for example, or New York had the different showrooms where you would go up there and buyers would be there and you would show your product line. You'd have this and this and that. You would have collection, depending on the industry, you would have collections 2 to 4 different time frames throughout the year, where you're designing, a year in advance, essentially, to show that line and so forth. So there's a lot of cost and development and planning from that standpoint. That was really, and there was a lot of waste as a result. And that's something else I can get into because what I've noticed from that
topic.
Yeah, we'll go back later. Over the course of the 10 years, trade shows are extremely expensive, especially when you're starting out. And what I learned the hard way is the return on investment is really nilch to zero. Really, the way I have ended up getting into places was initially doing trunk shows locally with the connections I had. And in my case, I was in California, Southern California. So I was working in Palm Desert. I was working and I just connected. I had, just kind of stretched through, and you're a big proponent of this, Felina. I looked through LinkedIn. That's where I did a lot of my research, is finding out who are the buyers, who's doing what, talking to people. And it's interesting when you're talking to more and more people you're talking to, how someone may have a connection somewhere along the way. And that's how, for example, I got my first big order from Palm Desert was through someone I met at Hera Hub, plug for Hera Hub, someone through Hera Hub who had worked with someone who was now in real estate in Palm Desert. And she's become a friend and a supporter and everything else. But I got my first huge order because of that connection.
Awesome.
So, but this has all changed now. With this pandemic, everything else, there were more manufacturers here locally as well as in LA. Because of the expense, so many different issues of having manufacturing here in California, especially. I would say from the people I started working with, contractors that I worked with in Orange County, LA County, and San Diego, I'd say 80% of them are now out of business.
Wow.
So
that is,
and that is my experience. So,
but it is, and given the situation we're in, not a surprise completely, but that's going to make it more difficult when I develop my shawl, my travel shawl.
Exactly. So where do you go? Where do you go? And I've had people, and it's interestingly enough, meanwhile, there's been folks, of course, many folks for many years have gone to China or other Southeast Asia, followed by Mexico. Not as, and again, and I can get into both differences, but China, for example, I have now customers or people that I've worked with in the past who had their product completely developed, made, and that was the beauty of China. You didn't have to, if you didn't want to deal with finding fabrics, doing designs, doing all that stuff, you would tell them what to do. They would figure it out for you. They'd give you a package.
Yeah.
Now you had time, you had differences in time. There was cultural issues. There were timing in regards to getting that product over from overseas here, and then making sure you're communicating correctly. So you had all these different things, and then many times folks worked with middlemen who could help you, middlemen and women who could help you find those different people. But what I was finding is people were trying to shift over back to the States or finding other suppliers, even amongst China or other Southeast Asia, sources. They did not have access to the actual what's called a technical package, which is the actual design, the actual patterns, if you say, and how to make the product, your recipe for making the product.
Yeah.
They were hijacked. And they could not so they would be coming back to us, and we would have to reinvent the wheel essentially. And then there's that added expense, and it's not inexpensive to do that, to start all over again, to build what they had just already had. So,
so you're saying you're seeing people move away from, and there's differences, right? You want economy of scale when you're manufacturing, hundreds of thousands of items.
Right.
And by way of our example of my travel shawl that I'm developing,
yes,
I may only be able to afford to do a run of 1,000 pieces, right? Especially when you get into apparel too. I can't even imagine how you planned for your manufacturing runs in regards to sizing. If somebody's making at one size, again, travel shawl,
that makes it lovely. That makes it lovely. Yeah,
exactly, right. But for you, who you're manufacturing a full clothing line, skirts and pants and jackets and shirts, how did you decide your sizing, and what did you learn along the way?
You start small. And you start with a small, in my case, a very small collection, couple of tops, bottom or two, more tops versus bottoms, a jacket. I mean, I wanted that ensemble, to make sure that the sizing worked, that the fabrics worked, and that people liked it. I mean, if people are not buying at trunk shows, that was the one thing. That was my proof of concept right there. I really, truly, truly believe in the proof of concept.
And
we also be really in love.
Yes. In that. You're so close to you're getting that immediate feedback. Our friend Nicole McDonald, she sold, similar idea of that direct with customers. She went to street fairs and farmers markets. For years, every single weekend, and getting that direct feedback is so invaluable.
Absolutely. And people like that too. And people remember that. Yeah. So from that standpoint, absolutely. Absolutely building that basis. Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to go back to design. You yourself, as we said, you've got a background in biotech and finance and sales and marketing, and you've got this very business focused background, and you weren't a designer, right?
No. No, I like clothes. I appreciate good design.
Yeah, exactly. And I love your story in developing Vivacity Sportswear of, you go golfing with your husband, you complain about the clothes, and he says, why don't you go do something about it? So you did.
Yeah, exactly. I love a challenge, obviously.
You found a designer. You hired a woman, Christina, that, is an apparel designer. How, how was that process of, working with a designer, and how'd you find her, frankly?
Yeah, well, when I was starting this, I had no clue. And I actually talked to different designers, and I worked with someone for a little while who, this is the part where you have to trust in your intuition. As we talk about, you actually know a lot more than you think at
Yeah.
times, or at least that inner voice that says, eh. And I worked with someone who gave a good, told a good story, but at the end of the day, she really didn't know what she was doing,
Yeah.
calling herself an expert, and she was causing some issues with some relationships I was trying to build with suppliers.
Mm.
So and I didn't know this until I stepped back in and became that main relationship person, and they were telling me. And I was able
Yeah.
to salvage those relationships because, quite honestly, my relationships with my suppliers, with everyone that I touch, my touch points are really important to me. And they have been, and I always thank my suppliers, my contractors, because they taught me so much of what I know in this business. So that to me is very important. So what I ended up doing is, making the ask. And again, I was in a co-working community at this point in time called Terra Hub. And I knew, and through this, through a connection through Terra Hub, I found Christina, and Christina is a very talented designer who's been in the business for many years. She's European, and I love that European aesthetic. I mean, that's just my thing. I'm not sure, but it created a little. It was part of the secret sauce, to be quite honest. And as we started working together, I realized she and we work differently. We have different strengths, but together we're pretty strong. And, I appreciate her background. I appreciate her aesthetic. I appreciate how she develops things. And it was really lovely because she's one of these designers. She's an artsy designer person from Switzerland. So she's Swiss German. So she tells me exactly what she's thinking, which I love. So I know where she's coming from. I love that. But if someone has an issue with a design, as we were testing things, she would be like, okay, why? And try to understand and respond to that, which I really appreciate. So she's very, very thoughtful in her approach. And I think it's really important to have that connection with your team. I can say that about our pattern makers. I can say that about some of our other contractors. I mean, the absolute delight of having my fabric cutter, call me and say, Vivian, this marker, for example, doesn't work. Yeah. I'm going to do this. I'm like, okay, I trust you. You have 30 years experience, please. And that's fantastic. And handling that versus waiting from an email or never hearing from another put together thing from Asia or something. And again, I don't want to bash Asia. I don't want to bash any of that. I mean, I've spent time in China. I've spent time in Asia. I'm working there back in my corporate career. But as you're starting out, it's just, if you really want to, you really need to be in there all the way, and you really need to learn. You can't just drop. I mean, you could if you hire the right people, but it's really tough. It's really, really tough to kind of let it go.
Yeah. Like you're saying, so much can go wrong in the process, regardless of whether you're doing, right here in San Diego or all the way in China. It makes it much more difficult to track down where those things are going wrong when it's, thousands and thousands of miles away, and the language and time zones and things of that nature. Let's talk money here. Over the years, and for those of you who don't know, I used to teach marketing and entrepreneurship at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. So I was teaching the business side of fashion, but I'd have a lot of students who had ideas for apparel or accessory lines. And, I would try to help them run the numbers, right?
Yeah.
Investment that they needed, an amount of money that they were going to have to commit to getting their line off the ground. And so, we'll run through it real quick here. I'm just going to blast through it, and then we can kind of go back and talk through these pieces, right? it's the initial investment for hiring a designer, right? Getting the designs, the patterns and the markers and all, your tech pack and all those things, right? So there's an expense there. And then buying the fabric or the materials or whatever it is, which, you can't just buy and, one bolt at a time, right? And the manufacturing and then it getting to you, then distributing it to your wholesalers or, depending on what your process is, right? So talk some numbers, maybe give us an example of a client that you've worked with recently, because I want to scare the heck out of people a little bit in this conversation, because I'm like, do you have 50 grand to invest? Because that's what it's going to take. And most people are like, no, I don't.
There is actually, and I should point this out of all places. So I have my Vivacity Sportswear website on Shopify, and they had it. And so the Shopify blog had a very good article, and I should have pointed it, and I'm going to point it out. I'm going to point it out on LinkedIn. Yeah. That talks about how much money do you really need to start a business. I mean, to your point, developing the product, you're going to be going through sets of samples because you're going to be testing things out. We recently did some work with someone on the East Coast who has a blouse design that she was trying to solve an issue for working moms who are still nursing. And she's very lovely design, so forth. We easily went through about 2 or 3 iterations just to start. Yeah. Thankfully, and again, and she's being very thoughtful in her approach. So I appreciate that. And she understands she's taking her time and, and throughout this, she's gone through a pandemic where people were not going into the office. Now that people want to get, so I actually told her your timing's great. I'm so glad you waited. But it takes that amount of time, and it took some back and forth, checking fabrics, what works for this type of blouse with the design and so forth. So you've got to understand all that. I've had some people who are just, we need it now. I've got 1,000 people, I had someone tell me, I've got a big following on Instagram and I'm really, really in a way. And I'm like, how many? Oh, wow, that's awesome that you've been doing this. Yeah. Well, I have, a few hundred, but they need it right now. And I'm like, are you sure they're followers? That doesn't mean they're buyers.
Yeah.
So because of a push where she's, pushing, and she has worked with easily 3 or 4 different contractors in the past and developers within the past year during the pandemic and has lost thousands of dollars.
Wow.
And still does not have a product. Because of this, again, so I really caution, I'm not saying you're going to take forever, but really the planning of development, that is the cost of starting out. In that development cost, if you can at least kind of calculate what it's going to take to find, whomever you need to hire to design, to start patterns, because design's one thing, then you've got to find someone who can make the pattern, then in this apparel case. And then you're looking for fabrics that work.
Yeah.
And then you've got a sample maker who's going to charge you a lot more for just 1 or 2 patterns. And then you've got to test it out. So how are you going to test that out?
Yeah.
And, you're going to continue that process. If you have more than one design, you've got to do it for each one. Yeah. And then you've got to understand what your sizing is. And how much, so it's a big process. So I would say start with, forecast something and pretty much triple it.
That's a good one.
Triple that.
Yeah.
And then once you have that, then you need to understand what your product cost is. That's where my finance background comes in, because I'm like, I just, I have a template and I'm like plugging everything. In fact, I was doing that yesterday. And looking at everything, and I was trying to do a comparison with some folks that I'm working with in Mexico versus what I could be doing here. Yeah. And, and I've got, right now with fabrics have gone up about 5 to 10% in cost because of tariffs if you're getting fabrics from China. But even fabrics here or so forth, shipping and freight costs have gone up 20, 30%.
Yeah.
And timing has been delayed because of the pandemic, because of, I just was on a seminar, a webinar yesterday from the Port of LA, talking about the backup in shipping and the lack of shipping containers. So all of that has to be placed into consideration right now. So take your time and understand you're going to need, if you think you're going to need this amount, at least triple it.
Yeah, good advice.
Start.
So Vivian, if somebody's thinking about developing an apparel or accessories line,
even after all this,
I know, right? Where I'm getting to here is, you need a guide, right? If this is your first rodeo, or even your second or third potentially,
right?
You need somebody to guide you through the process, and that's what Vivacity Advantage does. Am I right?
Yes. And we're trying to offer, we're actually in the process of updating our website. What we've done is what we've started doing is we provide kind of different approaches. So if you just need we call it a deep dive, a 2-hour session webinar recorded with not just, we provide you what you need beforehand, and we have you fill it out, and very straightforward and simple. You fill out what you can, and then we kind of go through it all.
Yeah.
What is your target audience? Who do you, depending on where you are in the process.
Yep.
And we record that and give you all that information and any follow-up. Right. So we do that.
So I could see where my blind spots are, where, what things that I probably hadn't even thought about.
Right. And then we also offer sourcing. So that other piece of it is where do I find my fabrics or trims, or who's going to manufacture my product, or do I need help in finalizing that pattern, that whole package, technical package you want to call it, but we want a package that you can bring to that's yours, and you can take to anyone, and they should be able to duplicate that and manufacture that. Awesome. So we offer those services, and then we offer kind of an accountability check-in once a month. How are you doing? You have specific questions, send those in, and then we'll jump on with you for half an hour once a month and help you get on your way. So you're keeping track.
That's awesome. That is great. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, if folks want to find you, Vivian, where's the best way for them to track you down?
Absolutely. Please follow us. We're at vivacityadvantage.com.
Okay.
And we're going to be relaunching our website soon, but you can definitely reach us through there. Also on LinkedIn and and on Instagram. So
awesome. Good deal. Well, good to see you today. Thanks for sharing some of your wisdom with us. Things to think about if folks are thinking about putting together, a new line, apparels, accessories. Reach out to Vivian and get her help. It'll save you a lot of time and
money. Yes, please avoid those pitfalls.
For sure. Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.